Hey everyone, so this lecture is going to be the first part of a two-part lecture series on global migration. For this first one, we're going to get into what we mean by global migration and really kind of get you to start thinking critically about borders and citizenship and what those concepts even mean. And then the second lecture is going to be using the history of the US-Mexico border as kind of a case study of how these different kind of concepts that you're going to be talking about in this lecture kind of come into play. So before we get into some of that, I really kind of want to just go over what I mean by global migration. And when I'm talking about global migration, I'm really talking about a mass exodus of people from the same geographic region. So this isn't just that people move from one place to another, because that's always occurred. But when we're talking about global migration, we're talking about large numbers of people leaving their home countries in search of, say, for example, economic opportunity. And so what we're really talking about when we talk about global migration is the formation of diasporas. And diasporas are basically when one population becomes more spread out over a wider geographic area. So a group of people kind of comes from being kind of more condensed into one area, and they move. They might go to another region of their own country. They might move to another country altogether, but they become more spread out over a wider area. And when that happens, that population of people have formed what's called a diaspora. And so there's kind of two primary forms of migration that we're talking about when we talk about global migration. And that could mean moving from one region of the country to another region of the same country. And this is intranational migration. So you're still moving within the same country. So, when we talk about the US-Mexico border, for example, many people moved from southern Mexico to northern Mexico where there was factory work in the northern Mexican region, right? That would be intranational migration. And the other type is international migration. So leaving your home country to live in an entirely different country altogether. So going from Mexico to the United States or going from India to the UK, right? Like moving from one country to another. And what the global migration is talking about is this idea that not just moving from one place to another, but that migration happens within the context of globalization and neoliberalism. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And there's a lot of common factors that kind of facilitate global migration, in particular migration on this kind of mass scale. And those things include economic decline, war, famine, and it happens because it becomes impossible to continue living in one's home country, or in the case of international migration, it becomes impossible to live in that particular region of your home country. And so what you have is these large numbers of people leaving in search of either economic opportunity or to escape the dangers of war and famine. And I want to take a moment to review a couple terms that you've already learned about, but I just want to go over them again because they're going to be important to understand for the next couple lectures. And the first is neoliberalism, and this idea of a free and unregulated market as the key to economic growth. And we've talked about the different tenets of neoliberalism, such as government deregulation, privatization of public resources, cuts to social spending, and individualism and personal responsibility, that emphasis, that kind of ideological foundation of neoliberalism. And we've also talked about globalization in this course, and the different kind of components that make different countries kind of more interconnected with each other. So that accelerated flow of capital, global cities, flow of people, altered social geography, and that increased and uneven interconnectedness, that even though we're becoming more interconnected, that interconnectedness is uneven. We all experience it differently, and not everyone benefits from it the same way, if at all. And so global migration occurs within this context. It occurs within this larger context of globalization and neoliberalism, particularly through the flow of people. And so these next couple lectures are really going to be focusing on that element of globalization, flow of people, and also kind of related to that, the altered social geographies that occur as a result of the flow of people. Your reading in particular is going to be kind of focusing more on that. When we're talking about global migration, we're talking about, in particular within the context of intercultural communication, we're talking about the larger global factors that bring people of different social locations into closer proximity with one another, and what those interactions look like and why they look the way that they do. And a large part of not only global migration, but the discourse around global migration and the experiences that people who leave their home countries have once they arrive in their new home, whether it's a new country or a different region of their home country, really kind of comes down to how we define our concept of nation, what it means that we live in a particular country, like the United States, for example, and how we come to see it that way. And so when we're talking about global migration, it's really important to kind of look at the concept of nation state. And so basically what a nation state is really just this idea of a country, right? That not just that we have a country, but that in theory that there's this idea that countries have kind of common languages and cultural practices and all of these different things that come together that form this thing called a nation. But a nation state really kind of has four general components, right? They have a centralized sovereign government, a stable permanent population, laws or constitution, and borders. You have all of these things, and all of these things comprise these things that we call a nation. So like the United States or the United Kingdom or China or Japan, right? All of these things have these kind of four components. And really what nation states do, or what the development of a nation state does, is it sets the parameters for who belongs and under what conditions someone belongs. Jumped ahead of myself a little bit there. Sorry about that. So it's really kind of this idea of when you were defining a nation state, we're defining who belongs within these borders. Who can call themselves a citizen, a part of the stable, permanent population of a nation state. And that becomes really important, not just to understand why people move, but the experiences that they have once they arrive in their new location. And what's also important to understand, I really kind of want to focus on one aspect in particular, well, two aspects in particular of nation states. And the first one is borders. And one thing that's really important to understand about borders is that they are constructed. And what that means is that they're man-made. They don't naturally occur. These are drawn by people to serve a very specific social, political, and economic purpose. So the photo on the left, for example, is of the border between San Diego, California, and Tijuana, Mexico. And it always really strikes me because it literally carries out into the Pacific Ocean. It really kind of speaks to the way in which dividing lines are what they're really supposed to represent. Because on one hand, you could very easily just kind of go out into the water a little bit and you'll be on the other side of the border. You'll be literally in another country, right? But it's also that it carries out into the ocean at all, really kind of raises important questions about what we're saying about not only borders, but about movement between borders. And really what borders do is that they define the lines of a nation state and what land is owned. They define the role of everyone within those borders. And they also help define our concept of citizenship, or that other aspect of nation states, the permanent stable population. And it really constructs citizenship in a way that is hierarchical and constructed. And what hierarchical means is that there's some people who are given more advantage and privilege than others. And so with that, I want to go into a little bit about citizenship. And citizenship can be really kind of defined in different ways. In the most formal legal sense, there's kind of different levels of citizenship, and I'm really focusing on the United States here, that a person can have. This isn't all the different ways, but these are kind of some common ways. Right? You might have someone who's a naturalized citizen, which means they're not necessarily U.S. born, but that U.S. people born in the U.S. automatically have citizenship. But naturalized means you've gone through this formal process to become a recognized U.S. citizen. Some people might have something like legal permanent resident status or conditional permanent resident status, which means they have kind of formal documentation that allows them to be in the country. They usually have to kind of re-up it every so often, but it is a more permanent, but this idea that you are going to be living here in the country in the long term. Some people are here on refugee asylee status. Some people are here on temporary visas. Or some people have some sort of documentation because they were victims of crimes or witnessed a crime, and so they're needed in the criminal justice system. Okay. But even when we're talking about citizenship, there's this idea that even naturalized citizens or even U.S. born citizens don't necessarily get the full benefits of being a citizen. And so then we have this concept of second-class citizenship. And what that means is that the people who are part of that permanent stable population of a nation state are not being awarded the same level of rights of people living within a nation state. So for example, people who were incarcerated upon release are not allowed to vote. Right, so it's called voter disenfranchisement. So someone who's been released from prison can't vote for president or can't vote for their local mayor. That would be an example of second-class citizenship, that because of something like your incarceration status or your criminal history, that you can no longer exercise your right to vote, a right that is given to permanent, stable residents of a nation state. And then you have people who are undocumented, unauthorized, or displaced. And what that means that those are people who are living here without any sort of authorization or formal documentation that says that they are allowed to live and work within the United States. And there's a lot of reasons that people come into a country through those means, and the second lecture is really going to go into that in depth. And the reason that I went into this along with borders, though, is because I want to really kind of begin a conversation about how we define a country, how we define borders, and how we define the concept of citizen, because all of those things come together to define who belongs and under what conditions somebody belongs. And those two questions become very, very important if we're going to understand how people communicate across social location. So before I end and get into the second lecture, which will be in another video about the history of the US-Mexico border, I just want to say a little bit about the word illegal. This is something that you come across in a lot of literature, and I just kind of want to lay some, let's call them ground rules for as we proceed for the rest of this content on global migration. And that is, no human being is illegal. To refer to someone as illegal is actually a slur, and I won't be referring to undocumented people as illegal, and I encourage all of you to do the same. And part of this because it says a person is criminal, like they themselves, their existence is criminal, which is not only impossible, but it's very demeaning. And it is actually not a crime to live in the United States without documentation. It's a civil offense. That might seem like semantics, but it's actually a very important distinction. And it is also not considered a crime to seek employment. The U.S. Supreme Court actually very recently ruled that it is not. But even more importantly, ignores the larger global processes that facilitate migration in the first place. And that's what our second lecture is really going to be focusing on. Is going to be focusing on the history of the US-Mexico border.